Case 1. Bailey Boswell, November 15, 2017. Saline County District Court, Nebraska. In a quiet Nebraska farming county, a young woman named Sydney Loof said goodbye to her roommates, checked her reflection one last time, and walked out the door for a second date. She would never come home again. Sydney was 24 years old, a hardware store clerk in Lincoln, known for her easy laugh and her devotion to her 3 dogs. She had joined the dating app Tinder like millions of other young people looking for connection. What she didn't know was that the profile she'd been messaging, a woman using the name Audrey, was not who she claimed to be. Behind that fake profile was Bailey Boswell, 23 years old at the time, operating in tandem with her boyfriend, 51-year-old Aubrey Trail. Over the course of several days, Boswell exchanged roughly 140 messages with Sydney, carefully building trust, before the two arranged a first meeting on November 14th. It went well enough that Sydney agreed to a second date the very next evening. On November 15th, before she left, Sydney posted a photo to Snapchat. The caption read, "Ready for my date." It was the last anyone would hear from her. Investigators would later reconstruct what happened with chilling precision. Surveillance footage placed Boswell and Trail at a Home Depot in the days leading up to the disappearance, purchasing tools and cleaning supplies. A detail prosecutors argued proved this was not a spontaneous act, but something planned in advance. When Sydney arrived at the pair's rented basement apartment in the small town of Wilbur, she was restrained and did not survive the encounter. What followed set off one of the largest missing persons searches in Nebraska history. For 3 weeks, the FBI, Nebraska State Patrol, and local law enforcement combed rural roads and fields across the southeastern part of the state. In early December, searchers began recovering Sydney's remains from ditches and open land near Edgar, Nebraska, roughly 90 miles from where she was last seen. The scale and method of concealment shocked even experienced investigators, and it became clear this had been a calculated attempt to make sure Sydney was never found whole. Trail and Boswell were arrested in Missouri weeks later. At trial, Boswell's defense argued she had been coerced and controlled by Trail, portraying her as a frightened accomplice rather than a willing participant. Prosecutors rejected that narrative entirely, presenting evidence that Boswell had actively participated in selecting and luring the victim, and that the crime bore the marks of a plan the couple had rehearsed before Sydney was ever chosen. Legal outcome: Aubrey Trail was convicted of first-degree murder and in 2021 was sentenced to death, a rare outcome in a state that has used capital punishment sparingly. Bailey Boswell was convicted by a jury in October of 2020 of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and improper disposal of human remains. She faced the possibility of becoming the first woman in Nebraska history sentenced to death. In November of 2021, a 3-judge panel could not reach the unanimous verdict required for a death sentence. One judge dissented, ruling the state had not met its burden of proof for the aggravating circumstances required. As a result, Boswell was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The Nebraska Supreme Court later upheld both her conviction and her sentence in full. Sydney Loof's family has spent years turning unimaginable grief into advocacy, speaking publicly about online dating safety and the importance of telling someone where you're going before a first, or second, date with someone you've only met online. Her case remains one of the clearest reminders of why that simple precaution matters. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 2. Carrie Jones. August 4th, 2022, Cedar County District Court, Nebraska. Laurel, Nebraska, is the kind of town most Americans have never heard of and never will. Fewer than 1,000 residents, a handful of church steeples, grain elevators standing over quiet streets, where, as longtime residents like to say, everybody knew everybody's business. Before August of 2022, the town's last homicide had happened back in 2005. And even that had been ruled manslaughter after a bar fight, not the kind of calculated multi-victim violence that would soon put Laurel's name in headlines across the country. At the center of what happened was a marriage. Jason Jones and his wife Carrie lived on Elm Street, across from an elderly couple named Jean and Janet Twyford, and down the block from a woman named Michelle Eberling. By every outward appearance, it was an ordinary block in an ordinary town. But inside that marriage, something had been building for a long time. A deep, festering resentment that Carrie Jones held toward her elderly neighbor, Jean Twyford, who she claimed had subjected her to years of unwanted sexually charged comments. Whether or not the full extent of her claims could ever be verified, what prosecutors would later prove beyond doubt was this: Carrie did not let that resentment stay quiet. She fed it, she nursed it, and eventually she turned it into a plan. On the night of August 4th, 2022, that plan became reality. Jason Jones left the home he shared with Carrie and walked first to the house of their neighbor, Michelle Eberling. He forced his way inside and shot her. From there, he crossed the street to the Twyford residence, where 86-year-old Gene Twyford lived with his 85-year-old wife, Janet, and their 55-year-old daughter, Dana. All three were shot inside their own home. Before he was done, Jason set both houses on fire using accelerants, an attempt, prosecutors argued, to destroy forensic evidence and erase the physical traces of what he'd just done. The fires burned so intensely that Jason himself was engulfed, suffering catastrophic burns across much of his body in the process. He would spend 2 months hospitalized before he was well enough to be moved into custody. Carrie Jones was not in either house when the shots were fired. She would maintain through years of legal proceedings that this distance meant something, that she could not be held responsible for a trigger she never pulled. Prosecutors saw it entirely differently. In their telling, Carrie was not a bystander swept up in her husband's actions. She was the architect who set them in motion. They pointed to a trail of text messages sent in the days and weeks leading up to August 4th, messages that prosecutors argued in closing statements needed to be read not in isolation, but in totality, as pieces of a single sustained campaign to push Jason toward violence against Gene Twyford specifically. It wasn't one angry message, they argued. It was a pattern, and the pattern didn't stop once the shooting was over. In the hours and days after the killings, as investigators from the Cedar County Sheriff's Office, the Nebraska State Patrol, and local police descended on Laurel, Carrie Jones remained in the home she shared with her husband, the same home from which, prosecutors say, she helped conceal him from the search that was closing in. She helped destroy physical evidence. She got rid of blood-soaked clothing connected to the crimes. For nearly 4 months after Jason was finally located, injured and hiding, by a Nebraska State Patrol SWAT team, Carrie Jones continued living her life in Laurel until December 16, 2022, when she too was taken into custody. The case against her moved slowly through the courts, delayed in part by the sheer complexity of prosecuting a spouse for encouraging, rather than committing, a quadruple homicide. Both trials, Jason's and later, Carrie's, were moved out of Cedar County entirely, granted changes of venue because the crime had so thoroughly saturated the small community that finding an impartial jury there had become effectively impossible. Jason's trial unfolded over 10 days in Dakota County in the fall of 2024. Carrie's trial, held roughly a year later in neighboring Madison County, ran from late July into early August of 2025. In an extraordinary moment during that trial, Jason Jones himself took the witness stand against his own wife's case, not on her behalf, but as part of the state's presentation, testifying about the events of that August night while still visibly marked by his injuries, so severely disfigured from his burns that he could not sit upright for an extended period and had not attended his own trial the year before for the same reason. Legal outcome. On August 7th, 2025, a Madison County jury convicted Carrie Jones of first-degree murder for her role in the death of Gene Twyford, along with tampering with physical evidence and accessory to a felony. On November 20th, 2025, Cedar County District Court Judge Brian Meismer sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole, along with 5 to 10 years for evidence tampering and 16 to 20 years for the accessory charge, running alongside the life sentence. She did not address the court. She simply listened as members of the victims' families read their impact statements aloud in the same courtroom where, hours later, a 3-judge panel would begin weighing whether her husband should face the death penalty for the 4 lives he took that night. That panel would go on to hand down its decision the following spring, sentencing Jason Jones to death, making him the newest addition to Nebraska's death row. For the people of Laurel, a town that had gone more than a century without violence like this touching its streets, the case became something the community has had to carry collectively. Grief for 4 neighbors lost in one night, and a long, painful reckoning with how quietly resentment can grow next door without anyone noticing until it's too late. If you are experiencing ongoing conflict with a neighbor that feels like it's escalating, local mediation services and law enforcement non-emergency lines exist specifically to help de-escalate situations before they turn dangerous. Reaching out early can make all the difference. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 3. Erica Jenkins, August 19, 2013, Douglas County District Court, Nebraska. To understand what happened to Curtis Bradford on a warm August night in Omaha, you first have to understand the 10 days that came before it, 10 days that remain, even now, among the darkest stretches in the city's history. In July of 2013, a man named Nico Jenkins walked out of the Nebraska State Penitentiary a free man. He had served roughly 10.5 years of an 18-year sentence for a violent carjacking and a string of assaults committed while incarcerated. He was released without any period of supervised parole, a detail that would later become the subject of intense public scrutiny and a wrongful release lawsuit against the state. Nico told prison psychiatrists strange things in the weeks before his release. He talked about ancient gods. He talked about being commanded to kill. Officials let him walk anyway. Within days, Nico had drawn his own family into his orbit. His sister Erica Jenkins, another sister named Lori Sales, and a cousin, Christine Bordeaux. What began as a family reunion of sorts curdled quickly into something far more sinister. A loosely organized crew moving through Omaha's parks and side streets, looking for people to rob. On August 11, 2013, Erica played a central role in luring 2 young men, Juan Uribe Peña and Jorge Cajiga Ruiz, to Spring Lake Park under false pretenses. It was Nico who fired the shots that ended both of their lives that night, but investigators and prosecutors made clear that Erica was not a passive bystander. She was, by every account presented at trial, the aggressive force driving the robbery itself, the one doing the talking, the one keeping the plan moving forward. 8 days later, on August 19th, the violence reached its most personal point yet. The next target wasn't a stranger. It was Curtis Bradford, a young man in his early 20s who had once served time alongside Nico and who, by all appearances, trusted him enough to agree to what he believed was going to be a robbery the two of them would carry out together. Erica helped set the plan in motion. Testimony from her own sister, Lori Sales, later described how Erica and Nico walked Bradford into an isolated area that night, armed and with intentions Bradford never saw coming. He did not survive the encounter. In the days that followed, family members would testify that Erica spoke about that night with something close to pride, describing her hands-on role in what had happened as though it were an accomplishment rather than a tragedy. Nico Jenkins would go on to claim responsibility for 4 murders across that 10-day span, a killing spree that shook Omaha to its core and led investigators to question how a man who had told mental health professionals he heard commands from an ancient serpent deity had been released without oversight in the first place. Erica Jenkins' own path through the justice system proved almost as turbulent as the crime itself. She frequently refused to appear in court. When she did appear, proceedings were marked by outbursts and open hostility toward the process. There was little pretense of remorse. Legal outcome. In January of 2015, a Douglas County jury convicted Erica Jenkins of first-degree murder, use of a deadly weapon to commit a felony, and possession of a deadly weapon by a prohibited person for her role in the death of Curtis Bradford. She received a flat life sentence. That was only the beginning of her legal reckoning. In separate proceedings, she was convicted on robbery charges tied to the August 11th incident and received decades of additional consecutive prison time. Years later, while incarcerated at the Nebraska Correctional Center for Women, she was convicted again, this time for viciously assaulting her own cousin, Christine Bordeaux, who had cooperated with prosecutors against the family. That assault left Bordeaux with a concussion and broken bones, and added still more years to Erica's sentence. She has since legally changed her name, but the life sentence for Curtis Bradford's death remains unchanged. The Nebraska Supreme Court reviewed and upheld her conviction on appeal, closing the door on her claims that the case against her had been insufficient. Nico Jenkins was ultimately convicted of all 4 murders and sentenced to death. The aggravating circumstances of his crimes and his refusal to show remorse weighing heavily in that decision. For the family of Curtis Bradford, and for the families of Juan Uribe Peña and Jorge Cajiga Ruiz, the case became a painful case study in the consequences of releasing a person the system itself had flagged as dangerous, without the safeguards that might have stopped what came next. Omaha's justice system used the aftermath to tighten its release review protocols, a small measure of accountability drawn from an enormous loss. If you or someone you know is affected by violence in your community, local victim advocacy centers across Nebraska offer confidential support and resources. You are not alone, and help is available. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 4. Shanna Liz Goliar. November 13th, 2012. Douglas County District Court, Nebraska. Some cases in this state are defined by a single violent night. This one is defined by 4 years of lies that followed it, a deception so elaborate, so obsessively maintained, that it would eventually become the subject of a Netflix documentary and a masterclass for investigators on how digital evidence can unravel even the most carefully constructed cover story. In 2012, an Omaha man named Dave Krupa found himself, quite by accident, dating 2 women at the same time. One was Carrie Farver, 37 years old, a devoted mother known for rarely missing her teenage son's sports games or band concerts. The other was Shanna Goliar, who went by Liz, a woman living just across the river in Persia, Iowa. When Krupa eventually chose to end things with Goliar and continue seeing Farver, something in Goliar shifted. On November 13th, 2012, Carrie Farver was last seen alive in Omaha. She never came home. She never picked up her son from school again. She simply, according to everyone who loved her, vanished. Except she hadn't. What actually happened to Carrie that night has never been fully recovered, because her body has never been found to this day. What investigators would eventually prove instead was almost stranger than the disappearance itself. For nearly 4 years afterward, someone kept Carrie alive. Online, threatening texts, furious emails, fake Facebook posts under Carrie's name, some of them cruel enough to make Krupa and Farver's own family believe she had simply become a different, angrier person and cut them off. Farver's mother, Nancy Rainey, spent years fielding messages that appeared to come from her daughter, some accusatory, some bizarre, never suspecting that the woman typing them wasn't her daughter at all, but the very woman her daughter had unknowingly been a romantic rival to. The digital trail, it turned out, was staggering in its scope. Thousands of messages sent from devices traced back to Goliar, crafted in Carrie's voice, engineered to keep investigators looking anywhere except at the woman who had actually orchestrated her disappearance. At one point, Goliar even set fire to her own home in Persia, an act that killed her own pets, and then attempted to pin the arson on Carrie Farver, the very woman she had already made disappear nearly a year earlier. It was, prosecutors would later argue, the act of someone so committed to the fiction she'd built that she was willing to sacrifice her own home and animals to keep it alive. For years, the case sat cold. It wasn't until digital forensic investigators painstakingly traced the technical fingerprints behind the fake accounts, IP addresses, device logs, login patterns that placed the Carrie account activity squarely in Goliar's possession, that the truth began to surface. In December of 2016, more than 4 years after Carrie Farver disappeared, Omaha police finally charged Shanna Goliar with first-degree murder and arson. The trial that followed, held as a bench trial before Douglas County District Judge Timothy Burns, stretched across 10 days and roughly 30 witnesses. There was no body. There was no confession. What there was instead was an overwhelming architecture of circumstantial and digital evidence. The electronic breadcrumbs of a woman who had spent 4 years pretending to be someone she had already ensured could never speak for herself again. Legal outcome. On May 24, 2017, Judge Burns delivered his verdict, guilty on both first-degree murder and second-degree arson. In his ruling, he was unequivocal that Carrie Farver had not simply walked away from her life. She had been the victim of a calculated plot, sustained through what he called years of impersonation and deception, designed to keep the truth buried. On August 15th of that same year, Goliar was sentenced to life in prison for the murder, with an additional 18 to 20 years for the arson, the sentences to run consecutively. She appealed, arguing the evidence against her had been too thin to convict. The Nebraska Supreme Court disagreed, unanimously upholding her conviction in 2018. Carrie Farver's family has spent more than a decade without the one thing every family in their position wants most, to bring her home. Her body remains missing. What they have instead is a small, hard-won measure of justice, and a case that investigators now use to teach a broader lesson, that in the modern age a killer's attempt to hide behind a screen can become the very evidence that convicts them. If you or someone you love is experiencing threatening or harassing behavior from an ex-partner or rival, resources like the National Domestic Violence Hotline are available around the clock, confidentially, to help you find safety. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 5. Wilma Caster, November 28, 1996, Buffalo County District Court, Nebraska. Some cases in this state don't announce themselves with speed or spectacle. They creep. They unfold over years, sometimes decades, hidden behind polite small-town appearances, until a body is found in a ditch and an entire community is forced to reckon with how well they thought they knew their neighbors. This is one of those cases. It begins not with a gunshot, but with paperwork. Thomas Brown Sr. was 53 years old, a railroad man from Kearney, Nebraska, whose work regularly took him out to eastern Wyoming and western Nebraska during the week. He was, by most accounts, a steady presence in a town that valued steadiness. His ex-wife, Wilma Caster, had been out of his life for a period of years before circumstances brought her back into it. In 1996, Wilma, then in her 50s herself, recently single again and living out west in Nevada, reconnected with Thomas. Whether out of old affection, obligation, or something more calculating, Thomas allowed her back into his life, and eventually into his home in Kearney. What Thomas didn't know, or perhaps didn't want to believe, was that Wilma had begun quietly, methodically, forging his signature. Court records would later detail a pattern that stretched across months. Unauthorized use of his financial transaction cards, forged checks, debts run up in his name without his knowledge. It wasn't a single desperate act. It was a slow-motion theft of his identity and his finances, conducted by someone he had let back into his home. Money and the fear of exposure became the fault line beneath everything that followed. When Thomas began to piece together what had been happening to his accounts, the confrontation that resulted was, according to court testimony, an angry one, a dispute over stolen funds that Wilma could no longer explain away. Prosecutors would later argue that Wilma understood exactly what was at stake. If Thomas reported what he'd discovered to authorities, the fraud alone could send her to prison. Silencing that threat, they argued, became her solution. On the night of Thanksgiving, November 28, 1996, while Thomas Brown slept in his own home, Wilma Caster retrieved a handgun. She fired 3 shots into his neck and into his chest, while he lay defenseless. He never had the chance to fight back or even to fully wake. What happened next revealed a coldness that would haunt investigators for years. Rather than call for help, rather than flee, Wilma, investigators allege, with the help of her son, first moved Thomas's body into the basement of his own home, where it remained hidden for 2 full days. During that window, Wilma continued spending Thomas's money, using his cards and accounts as though nothing at all had happened, as though the man whose funds she was draining wasn't lying dead just beneath her feet. Eventually, the body could no longer stay hidden. Wilma and her son drove Thomas's body out to a rural stretch of road near Riverdale, northwest of Kearney, and left him in a muddy roadside drainage ditch, discarded, prosecutors would later say, like trash. To cover the widening gap in her story, Wilma constructed an elaborate lie. She told investigators and family members that she had last seen Thomas willingly climbing into a mysterious, primer-colored brown pickup truck, driven by someone she couldn't identify, as though he had simply chosen to vanish with a stranger.
For 12 days that story held.
Then, on December 10, 1996, a passerby made a discovery that would unravel everything. Thomas Brown's body, found partially concealed beneath a barbed wire fence along the ditch, his coat and work boots missing, his body already frozen in the early winter cold. The forensic case against Wilma began to build methodically. Investigators recovered unspent ammunition matching the caliber used in the shooting. Gunshot residue analysis on Thomas's clothing indicated the shots had been fired from extremely close range, consistent with someone standing over him as he slept, not a stranger firing from a distance during some chance encounter on a rural road. And the financial trail was damning. Forged checks, unauthorized card charges, a paper record of exactly the kind of fraud that gave Wilma a motive investigators could trace to the dollar. Legal outcome. In December of 1997, After 32 hours of jury deliberation, Wilma Castor was convicted of first-degree murder, along with several counts of forgery and related financial crimes. But that conviction wouldn't be the end of the story. On appeal, the Nebraska Supreme Court identified errors in how evidence and testimony had been handled at trial, and in 1999, her conviction was overturned, forcing Buffalo County prosecutors to rebuild their case from the ground up and take Wilma to trial a second time. That second trial left little room for doubt. Prosecutors returned with an airtight timeline of the financial forgeries and forensic ballistics evidence that thoroughly dismantled her brown pickup truck story once and for all. A second jury found her guilty again. First-degree murder, 5 counts of forgery, use of a firearm to commit a felony, and misuse of a financial transaction device. Her permanent life sentence began on April 26, 2000. For years, even from inside the Nebraska Correctional Center for Women in York, Wilma Castor maintained her innocence, pursuing appeals and requesting a transfer to an out-of-state facility to be closer to family. It wasn't until decades later, during an in-prison interview, that she finally admitted what the evidence had shown all along, that she had in fact killed Thomas Brown. She spent her final years still incarcerated, growing old within the same walls, until she died in custody of medical complications on December 2, 2024 at the age of 76, nearly 3 decades after that Thanksgiving night in Kearney. The Brown family never received an apology that came in time to matter. What they were left with instead was the long, slow satisfaction of watching the truth finally catch up to a lie that had outlived a courtroom, an appeal, and almost 30 years of denial. If you suspect a loved one may be experiencing financial exploitation or coercion at the hands of someone close to them, Adult Protective Services and local elder abuse hotlines exist in every state to help investigate and intervene before it's too late. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 6. Rachel Bickerstaff. September 27, 2024. Douglas County District Court, Nebraska. Some nights in Omaha end quietly. This was not one of them. Just after 1 o'clock in the morning on September 27, 2024, a Jeep Grand Cherokee tore through downtown Omaha at a speed that would later stop investigators in their tracks. Behind the wheel was Rachel Bickerstaff, 33 years old. In the vehicle with her were her 3 young daughters, 5-year-old Amia, 18-month-old Amelia, and her newborn baby, Emiliana. By every measure that matters, they should have been safe, asleep at home. Instead, they were passengers in a car being driven by their own mother while she was, according to forensic testing conducted later that morning, nearly 3 times over the legal limit for alcohol. The vehicle's own electronic data recorder, the so-called black box, every modern car carries, would later tell investigators exactly what happened in painstaking, undeniable detail. Bickerstaff was traveling eastbound on Douglas Street at a peak speed of 142 miles per hour. At the intersection with 10th Street, she blew through a red light without slowing. On the other side of that intersection was 70-year-old Michael Sales, a grandfather from Council Bluffs, Iowa, driving home in his Subaru Outback after finishing a shift at his second job with FedEx. The kind of quiet, hard-working routine that defined who he was to the people who loved him. He had just completed a left turn, doing everything right, when Bickerstaff's Jeep struck his vehicle at a speed investigators would later call almost incomprehensible for a city street. The force of the impact was so severe that it drove both vehicles eastward across the intersection, sending the Subaru into a light pole. Both cars erupted into flames almost immediately. Michael Sales died at the scene. So did Bickerstaff's 5-year-old daughter Amia and her newborn baby Emiliana. Her 18-month-old, Amelia, survived the initial crash and was rushed to a hospital in Kansas City, clinging to life for several agonizing days before she too did not survive her injuries. Rachel Bickerstaff herself survived, though severely injured. The blood alcohol content recorded during her emergency room admission was .216, nearly triple the legal threshold for driving. Court records later revealed this was not her first encounter with the consequences of drunk driving. She had a prior DUI conviction from April of 2020, 4 years before the crash that would take 4 lives, including 2 of her own children. What followed in the months before her sentencing only deepened the portrait investigators and prosecutors were building. While being held at the Douglas County Jail awaiting trial, Bickerstaff was involved in a physical altercation with her cellmate, striking her in the face, an incident prosecutors would later point to as evidence of a continuing pattern of volatility, even in the shadow of the tragedy she had caused. In March of 2025, Bickerstaff entered a plea of no contest to 4 counts of motor vehicle homicide, sparing the community and Michael Sales's grieving family a lengthy and painful trial. A 5th charge, for causing serious bodily injury while driving under the influence, was dropped as part of the agreement. Her sentencing hearing, held in June of 2025 before Douglas County District Court Judge Molly Keene, became one of the most emotionally devastating proceedings the courthouse had seen in years. Michael Sales's daughter, Laura, described in raw, unfiltered testimony what it felt like to receive the call telling her that her father was gone, dropping to the floor of her own living room, unable to process the words. Bickerstaff herself addressed the court through tears, telling the judge and the families gathered there that she understood no apology could undo what had happened, that she wished she could trade her own life for the ones that were lost, and that she recognized she needed help far beyond anything a courtroom could offer. Judge Keene, in handing down her sentence, acknowledged that she believed Bickerstaff's remorse in that moment was genuine, but weighed that against the documented risk that without serious intervention, the same patterns of substance abuse could repeat themselves. Legal outcome. Judge Keene sentenced Rachel Bickerstaff to a term of 140 to 180 years in state prison, up to 45 years for each of the 4 counts of motor vehicle homicide, ordered to run consecutively, one sentence stacked directly on top of the next. Under Nebraska's statutory good time provisions, Bickerstaff will not be eligible to even apply for parole until she has served a flat minimum of 70 years, meaning for all practical purposes, the sentence will keep her behind bars for the remainder of her natural life. Prosecutors in Douglas County described it afterward as one of the most devastating drunk driving cases the county had ever handled. For Michael Sales's family, the case became a public reckoning with a decision that took just moments to make and consequences that will last generations. A father, a daughter, and a barely lived infant life, all lost to choices made behind the wheel of a car that should never have left the driveway that night. If you or someone you know struggles with alcohol use, particularly around decisions involving driving or the safety of children, confidential resources like the Sam AXA National Helpline are available at no cost any hour of the day to connect you with support before tragedy strikes. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 7, Chantal Randall, August 21st, 2006, Sarpy County District Court, Nebraska. There is a particular kind of trust that parents place in the hands of the people who watch their children while they're at work. A trust built on reputation, on familiarity, on the quiet assumption that the person answering the door each morning would never let anything happen to the small, vulnerable person being handed over to them. In Bellevue, Nebraska, in the summer of 2006, that trust was broken in a single, irreversible moment, and then, in the hours that followed, betrayed again in a way that shocked even seasoned investigators. Chantal Randall was 30 years old, an independent babysitter who ran a small in-home childcare operation out of her house in Bellevue, a Sarpy County community just south of Omaha. She was, by the accounts of the families who trusted her, a familiar and reliable presence. Someone parents felt comfortable leaving their children with day after day. Among those children was Rosalind Clark, known to everyone as Rosie, a 17-month-old toddler who had been in Randall's care for most of her short life. On the afternoon of August 21st, 2006, Randall was watching 5 young children at once, a full house, and a lot for any caregiver to manage, especially one who was at the time pregnant herself. According to what Randall later told investigators, Rosie approached her that afternoon, simply trying to get her attention the way toddlers do, and reached up to pull at Randall's hair. What happened next has never been adequately explained by anything other than a sudden, violent loss of control. Randall struck the toddler with enough force to cause catastrophic internal injuries, trauma to Rosie's abdomen severe enough to rupture her liver and cause extensive internal bleeding. It was an injury profile more consistent with a serious accident or assault than anything a child that age should ever experience in the care of an adult entrusted to protect her. What followed was in some ways more disturbing to investigators than the injury itself. Rather than immediately calling for emergency help as Rosie's condition deteriorated, Randall made a choice that would come to define how prosecutors and later the public understood this case. She attempted to construct a cover story before she ever picked up the phone. She placed a coin in the dying child's throat, staging the scene to suggest that Rosie had accidentally choked while playing, an explanation that, on its face, might have satisfied a first responder moving quickly through a chaotic scene. It was only after that staging was complete that Randall called for emergency services and relayed her false account of what had happened. Rosie did not survive. The deception did not hold. When Sarpy County medical examiners conducted a thorough autopsy, the physical evidence told a different story than the one Randall had offered paramedics. The internal trauma responsible for Rosie's death had occurred before the coin was ever placed in her throat, meaning the choking explanation wasn't just false, it had been fabricated after the fact, layered on top of an injury that had nothing to do with any accident. The timeline the autopsy revealed was damning and precise, and it left no room for the story Randall had told. Facing the weight of that forensic evidence her own defense team recognized could not be meaningfully disputed at trial, Randall's legal team began negotiating with prosecutors rather than risk a jury hearing the full account of what the medical examiners had found. Legal outcome. In November of 2007, Chantal Randall accepted a plea agreement, entering a plea of no contest to a charge of child abuse resulting in death, a resolution that avoided the top-tier first-degree murder charge she had originally faced, but still carried serious, lasting consequences. In January of 2008, she was sentenced to a term of 25 to 35 years in state prison. For Rosie Clark's family, the case remains a wrenching reminder that the people we trust most with our children are not always who we believe them to be, and that even a single sudden loss of control can end a life that had barely begun. In the years since, child advocacy organizations across Nebraska have used cases like this one to push for stronger licensing and oversight standards for informal, in-home childcare providers, a small but meaningful shift meant to give parents better tools to protect the children they can't watch every hour of the day. If you are a parent seeking guidance on evaluating childcare safety, or if you have concerns about a child's well-being, the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline is available confidentially, 24 hours a day, to offer support and guidance. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 8, Karen Geisler, October 20th, 2024, Buffalo County District Court, Nebraska. Not every case on this list is a story of cold calculation. Some are far messier, far harder to categorize. Stories where the line between perpetrator and victim blurs the closer you look, and where a courtroom's job becomes less about identifying a villain and more about weighing decades of pain against a single, irreversible act. On the afternoon of October 20th, 2024, at approximately 2:10 in the afternoon, the Kearney Police Department received an emergency call reporting an active shooting inside a home in the 1800 block of 7th Avenue. Officers arriving on scene found 57-year-old Karen Geisler standing outside the residence. She was taken into custody without incident, calm by most accounts, in the immediate aftermath of what had just happened inside. Inside the home, first responders found her husband, 62-year-old Jimmy Geisler, suffering from critical gunshot wounds. Officers administered emergency first aid at the scene before paramedics were able to take over, and Jimmy was rushed to the intensive care unit at CHI Good Samaritan Hospital in Kearney. He fought for 5 days before he ultimately succumbed to his injuries on October 25, 2024. For months, the public knew almost nothing about what had actually happened inside that house. At the request of the Buffalo County Attorney, a judge sealed the arrest affidavit, the document that would normally lay out, in an officer's own words, the circumstances and motive behind an arrest. What the community was left with instead was speculation, headlines calling it a domestic dispute, and very little context for how a 57-year-old woman with no violent history had ended up standing outside her own home while her husband lay dying inside it. It would take more than a year and a formal request from local journalists after Geisler's sentencing for a judge to finally unseal that affidavit, and when it was released, it reframed the entire case. According to Karen Geisler's own statements to investigators, the shooting did not happen in a vacuum. She told police that Jimmy had been abusing her for years, and that on the day of the shooting, she had a firearm nearby specifically because she believed he was going to hurt her. During an argument between the two of them, she says she warned him that if he came near her, she would use it. According to the affidavit, Jimmy did not heed that warning. He was shot in the throat during the confrontation that followed. When investigators asked her to explain what had happened, her response, preserved in the affidavit, was simply, "What was I supposed to do?" Toxicology testing also showed Karen had a blood alcohol level of 0.26 at the time, more than 3 times the legal limit, a detail prosecutors would use to argue her judgment and account of events could not be fully trusted, even as her defense pointed to it as evidence of a woman in crisis, not calculation. The case moved through the legal system carrying that unresolved tension the entire way. Geisler was originally charged with second-degree murder, along with use of a firearm to commit a felony. Charges that were for a period amended even further, briefly reduced toward manslaughter before prosecutors ultimately settled on a middle path. Legal outcome. In August of 2025, Karen Geisler agreed to a plea bargain, entering a plea of no contest to an amended charge of attempted second-degree murder along with the weapons felony. On October 24, 2025, Buffalo County District Court Judge Patrick Lee sentenced her to 20 to 40 years in prison for the attempted murder charge and an additional 11 to 15 years for the weapons conviction, ordered to run consecutively, a combined structural sentence of 31 to 55 years. She received 270 days credit for time already served. Her legal team filed a formal appeal with the Nebraska Court of Appeals the following month, arguing not that she was innocent, but that the length of the sentence itself did not adequately account for the documented history of abuse she says preceded the shooting. The Geisler case has become, in the years since, a frequently cited example in conversations about how the justice system handles violence that emerges from long-term domestic abuse, cases that resist easy categorization as either a cold-blooded crime or a clear-cut act of self-defense, and instead sit somewhere painfully in between. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic violence, the National Domestic Violence Hotline offers free confidential support 24 hours a day. You do not have to face it alone, and help is available before a situation like this one becomes irreversible. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 9, Lavetta Langdon, August 20th, 2020, Red Willow County District Court, Nebraska. Some cases don't ask a jury to determine what happened. Everyone already knows what happened. What they're asked to determine instead is what it means, what decades of silence and fear can do to a person, and where the line falls between a crime and a final act of survival. In McCook, Nebraska, a small city in the southwestern part of the state, Larry and Lavetta Langdon had been married since 1960. By the summer of 2020, they had been husband and wife for 60 years, a marriage that, from the outside, carried the appearance of a long, ordinary life together. What the outside world didn't see, according to what would later come out in court, was a relationship defined for decades by fear. On August 20th, 2020, McCook police officers responded to a call at the Langdon residence. What they found inside was 79-year-old Larry Langdon, shot to death in his own bed. His wife, also 79 at the time, was waiting for them. She did not run. She did not deny what she had done. Lavetta Langdon surrendered to police on the spot and confessed immediately to the shooting. What she told investigators next would reshape how the entire case was understood, prosecuted, and ultimately resolved. According to the arrest affidavit, Lavetta described a marriage stretching back 30 years, by some accounts, closer to 50, marked by sustained, severe domestic abuse. She told investigators she had once warned Larry directly, if he ever struck her again, she would kill him. It was not an idle threat born of a single argument. It was, according to her account, the culmination of a lifetime of fear finally spoken aloud. On the day of the shooting, that fear became reality once more. A dispute over money escalated into violence, and Larry struck Lavetta across both sides of her face with a closed fist. What happened afterward reveals something important about the nature of the case. Lavetta did not act in the heat of that moment. She went to her bedroom. She sat alone. For 30 minutes she remained there, according to her own account, contemplating her safety and coming to terms with a realization she said she had carried for years. that the cycle of violence in her marriage would eventually end with her own death, if nothing changed. Once Larry had gone to his own room and fallen asleep, Lavetta retrieved a loaded handgun. She walked into his bedroom and, while he lay unconscious, shot him twice in the chest. She then called the police herself. What set this case apart, even among cases involving documented domestic abuse, was the response from the Langdons' own adult children. Rather than distancing themselves from their mother or disputing her account, several of the couple's daughters testified in court on her behalf, describing their father as a man the entire family had feared for decades, and confirming that they too had been victims of his violence growing up in that household. It is rare for a homicide case to feature the victim's own children advocating not for harsher punishment, but for mercy toward the person who killed him. Prosecutors in Red Willow County faced a genuinely difficult decision. The facts, as Lavetta herself had described them, initially supported a charge of first-degree premeditated murder. The 30 minutes of contemplation before the shooting could be read as evidence of premeditation, which under Nebraska law carries a mandatory flat life sentence. But the documented history of abuse, corroborated by family testimony and Lavetta's own consistent account, complicated that path considerably. Legal outcome. In June of 2021, prosecutors and Lavetta's defense reached an agreement. She pleaded no contest to a reduced charge of manslaughter and was sentenced to 8 to 10 years in prison, a fraction of what a first-degree murder conviction would have carried. She began serving her sentence at the Nebraska Correctional Center for Women in York. By then already in her 80s, her case did not end there. In January of 2024, the Nebraska Board of Pardons took the rare step of unanimously voting to commute her sentence, a decision influenced heavily by her age, her health, and the documented history that had shaped the case from the beginning. With that commutation in place, Lavetta became eligible for parole for the first time. She appeared before the Nebraska Parole Board shortly afterward, and on February 14, 2024, she was officially released on discretionary parole, 82 years old, walking free after not quite 3 years behind bars, into a family that had stood by her the entire time. Lavetta Langdon's case has become one of the most cited examples in Nebraska of how documented, sustained domestic abuse can shape not just a defense strategy, but the collective judgment of prosecutors, judges, and even a state pardons board. Her daughter later encouraged others in similar situations to leave before a moment like this one becomes their only remaining option. If you or someone you love is living with domestic violence, the National Domestic Violence Hotline is available confidentially at any hour and can help you build a safety plan before a crisis point is ever reached. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 10. Jessica Burgess, April 2022, Madison County District Court, Nebraska. Not every case that shakes a community involves a body found in a ditch or a marriage marked by violence. Some cases become defining moments for entirely different reasons, because they land at the exact intersection of family law and a rapidly shifting legal landscape, and because a private family crisis becomes, almost overnight, a matter of national debate. In April of 2022, in the northeastern Nebraska city of Norfolk, 41-year-old Jessica Burgess made a decision that would ultimately draw scrutiny from across the entire country. Her 17-year-old daughter Celeste was pregnant, far enough along, according to court records, that she was well into her 3rd trimester, past the 20-week statutory limit that governed legal abortion access in Nebraska at the time. Rather than pursuing options through a medical provider, Jessica ordered abortion medications online from an out-of-state source and gave them to her daughter. What happened next unfolded quietly within the family until a tip reached the Norfolk Police Department suggesting that Celeste had unexpectedly given birth to a stillborn fetus at home and that the family had buried it rather than reporting it. That tip opened an investigation that would eventually draw in federal-style digital forensics on what at first glance looked like a deeply private family matter. Detectives secured a court-authorized search warrant for private Facebook messages exchanged between Jessica and Celeste. What those messages revealed became the backbone of the state's case, a documented conversation trail in which Jessica walked her daughter through how to take the medication to end the pregnancy, discussed how far along the pregnancy actually was, and perhaps most damaging of all, coordinated a plan with her daughter to destroy the evidence afterward. Investigators used that digital trail to locate a field north of Norfolk, where fetal remains had been concealed. Forensic examination confirmed that the remains had been placed in a plastic bag, transported to a rural area, buried, and ultimately burned. The case quickly became something larger than a single Nebraska prosecution. It arrived in the midst of a profound national shift in reproductive law, following the U.S. Supreme Court's overturning of Roe v. Wade earlier that year, and it raised urgent, widely debated questions about digital privacy, specifically how private messaging platforms can become evidence in prosecutions tied to reproductive healthcare decisions. Legal commentators, journalists, and advocates across the political spectrum weighed in, turning what began as a local Madison County case into a flashpoint followed by national and even international media. Facing the weight of the digital evidence against her, Jessica Burgess made the decision to resolve her case through a plea agreement rather than risk trial. Legal outcome. In July of 2023, Jessica Burgess pleaded guilty to 2 felonies, performing an abortion beyond 20 weeks and tampering with human skeletal remains, along with a misdemeanor charge of providing false information to law enforcement. On September 22, 2023, Madison County District Court Judge Mark Johnson denied her defense's request for probation, stating plainly in his ruling that she had gone to extraordinary lengths to circumvent state law. She was sentenced to 2 years in state prison. Her daughter, Celeste, was prosecuted separately for her role in what followed the procedure. She was ultimately sentenced to 90 days in jail, followed by 2 years of probation, a resolution that closed the criminal chapter for both mother and daughter, even as the broader legal and ethical questions their case raised continued to reverberate well beyond Nebraska's borders. The Burgess case remains, to this day, one of the most closely watched examples of how existing communication and privacy laws are being tested in an entirely new legal environment. A case study cited by lawmakers, privacy advocates, and legal scholars alike as the post-Roe landscape continues to take shape across the country. If you or a loved one are navigating a difficult or unplanned pregnancy and need confidential guidance, resources are available through licensed medical providers and organizations equipped to provide accurate, judgment-free information appropriate to your state's current laws. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you've enjoyed this full series on Nebraska's most notorious women, don't forget to like this video and drop a comment below telling us which case shocked you the most. We read every single one. 10 women. 10 courtrooms across the state of Nebraska. 10 stories that on the surface could not look more different from one another. A Tinder date that ended in a rural ditch. A quiet town called Laurel that lost 4 neighbors in a single night. A digital ghost kept alive for 4 years by a woman who couldn't let go of a lie. A babysitter's moment of rage disguised as an accident. A marriage of 60 years that ended with a warning finally kept. And yet, looking back across all 10, a pattern begins to emerge. Not of evil in the cartoonish sense true crime sometimes reaches for, but of something far more unsettling, how ordinary the beginnings of these stories were. A dating app conversation. A neighbor's comment taken the wrong way. A family bond twisted into a weapon. A long marriage nobody outside its 4 walls ever fully understood. Rosie Clark's mother once said she trusted the woman babysitting her daughter the same way any parent would. Carrie Farver's mother spent years believing the messages she received actually came from her daughter. Jimmy Geisler's neighbors likely never guessed what was happening behind that door on 7th Avenue. Larry Langdon's own children carried a truth for decades that the rest of the world never saw. What connects Sidney Loof, Carrie Farver, Curtis Bradford, Jean and Janet and Dana Twyford, Michelle Eberling, Thomas Brown, Michael Sales, and his 3 tiny co-victims, Rosalind Clark and Jimmy Geisler, is not just that each of them lost their life in this state. It's that each of their deaths forced a Nebraska courtroom, and by extension, all of us, to sit with a hard question. What do we do when the person responsible isn't a stranger in the dark, but someone who had already been let in? A boyfriend's girlfriend, a spouse of 60 years, a trusted caregiver, a daughter's own mother. Justice in these 10 cases did not look the same twice. Some women are spending the rest of their lives behind bars with no possibility of ever walking free again. One died in custody after decades of denial, only confessing near the very end. One walked out of prison at 82 years old, released not because what she did wasn't taken seriously, but because the system ultimately weighed 30 years of documented suffering against a single act taken in the dark. That range, from life without parole to a pardon board's unanimous mercy, is itself the story. Nebraska's courts did not treat these 10 women as a single category. Each case was investigated, argued, and judged on its own facts, however painful those facts were to sit with. If there's one thread worth carrying with you after these 10 cases, it's this. Violence rarely announces itself in advance. It builds quietly, in patterns most of us are trained to overlook. A controlling relationship, a resentment left to fester, a child's caregiver never properly vetted, a family secret nobody outside the house ever heard. The resources we've mentioned throughout this series, domestic violence hotlines, child abuse hotlines, elder protective services, exist precisely because so many of these stories had a moment, sometimes years before the worst happened, when intervention might have changed everything. To the families of Sydney, Carrie, Curtis, Jean, Janet, Dana, Michelle, Thomas, Michael, Amir, Amelia, Emiliana, Rosie and Jimmy, this series exists because your loved ones deserve to be remembered as more than a headline, and because the truth of what happened to them, however difficult, deserves to be told accurately and with care. That's the full story of 10 of Nebraska's most notorious women, from Wilbur to Laurel, from Omaha to Mac Cook, from 1996 to 2025. If this series kept you gripped from the first case to the last, you know what to do. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next deep dive from Cold Case Hour. Drop a like to help this reach more true crime fans, and let us know in the comments which case stayed with you the longest. We'll see you in the next one.